The morning sun had barely touched the skyline of New York when Ethan Cole stared blankly at the cold, empty desk in front of him. Once, this very desk had been the control center of a thriving business, a tech startup that promised innovation, hope, and a future beyond imagination. Now, it was nothing but a symbol of defeat. The phone calls had stopped. The investors had pulled back. The employees, people he had once called family, had walked away with silent eyes and heavy hearts. Ethan's company, Skybridge Technologies, had officially shut down 3 weeks ago. At 34, he had gone from being featured in Forbes' top entrepreneurs to watch list of living in a one-bedroom apartment with overdue rent notices piling up on the counter. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger had faded weeks ago, replaced by a heavy silence that lived in his chest like a permanent storm. Ethan had started Skybridge 5 years earlier with 2 college friends, Ryan and Lucas. Their idea was simple: create an AI-driven logistics software that could save millions for transport companies by optimizing routes and predicting delays. It worked, at least in the beginning. Their pilot tests were successful. They landed 2 mid-sized clients. Ethan felt unstoppable, the kind of young man who believed failure was something that happened to other people. But success can be cruel when it comes too fast. They expanded rapidly, opened 2 offices, and hired 50 employees within a year. Investors came knocking, offering millions. Ethan, without thinking twice, took the deals. He bought new cars, a bigger house, and promised everyone, including himself, that Skybridge was going to change the world. But then came the market crash. One of their main clients went bankrupt, taking 40% of Skybridge's revenue with them. Another investor pulled out after a failed product update caused delays and bugs. Ethan tried to hold everything together, but every patch he applied opened another crack. 6 months later, Skybridge was drowning in debt. When his co-founder Ryan left, Ethan didn't even try to stop him. He understood. Everyone was tired of the same speeches about staying strong and holding faith. It was over. One evening, Ethan drove to the old company office, now locked and dark, and sat in the parking lot. He thought about everything he had lost: his savings, his home, his relationships, and worse, his confidence. Failure wasn't just losing money. It was losing yourself. He sat there for hours, staring at the building, until rain began to fall, blurring the world outside. He whispered to himself, "Maybe I wasn't made for this." That night, Ethan returned home and sat by the window until sunrise. He thought about calling his parents back in Ohio, but he couldn't. He didn't want to hear disappointment in their voices. Instead, he made coffee and stared at a blank notebook on the table. Then something strange happened. He began to write, not about money or business plans, but about what went wrong. Every decision, every mistake, every lesson. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a confession pouring from a soul that had carried too much weight for too long. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks. By the end of the month, Ethan had filled 2 notebooks with reflections, not on how to succeed, but on how to survive failure. One afternoon, while at a small cafe, Ethan met an old acquaintance, David Lynn, a venture capitalist who had once shown interest in Skybridge before the company collapsed. David looked surprised to see him. "Ethan, I thought you moved to San Francisco." Ethan smiled weakly. "I moved everywhere except forward." They talked for an hour, not about investments or profits, but about what Ethan had learned from losing everything. When Ethan told David about his notebooks, David listened quietly. Then, with genuine curiosity, he asked, "Do you know how many entrepreneurs would kill to read something honest like that?" Ethan laughed. "No one wants to read about failure." David shook his head. "You're wrong. Everyone fails, but very few talk about it." That one conversation planted a seed. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Ethan started turning his notes into a blog. He titled it The Broken Startup. He wrote openly about his rise and fall, the ego, the mistakes, the loneliness, the moments when he wanted to give up. At first, only a few readers stumbled upon it, but one of his posts, "The day I fired myself" went viral. Entrepreneurs across the country began sharing it, saying it was the most honest thing they had read about startup failure. Emails flooded in from people thanking him for making them feel less alone. Ethan realized something powerful. He had lost a company, but he had found his voice. Soon, small business conferences began inviting Ethan to speak. He talked about resilience, the psychology of failure, and how to rebuild confidence when everything collapses. One day, after a talk in Austin, a young entrepreneur approached him. "Mr. Cole, your story saved my startup," the man said, tears in his eyes. "I was ready to quit last week, but after reading your blog, I decided to try again." That moment changed Ethan forever. He understood that success wasn't just about building companies. It was about building people, including yourself. By the end of that year, Ethan was no longer the man sitting alone in a dark parking lot. He was someone new, wiser, stronger, and humble. But destiny wasn't done with him yet, because what came next would test everything he had learned. The next morning, Ethan Cole woke up at 6 a.m., not because of an alarm, but because something deep inside had changed. For the first time in a long time, he had direction. His blog, The Broken Startup, had grown into a movement. Entrepreneurs from across the United States, even some from overseas, were messaging him daily, sharing their own failures and how his words gave them strength. He was no longer the man people pitied. He was the man they looked to for hope. But Ethan wasn't satisfied with just writing. He knew words were powerful, but only if they led to action. One evening, Ethan sat in his small apartment, scrolling through messages on his laptop. A single sentence from a struggling business owner caught his eye. "I have no mentor, no funding, and no one who understands what it's like to fail like I did." Ethan paused. He remembered being in that same place, lost, ashamed, and invisible. That message lit a fire in him. He thought, what if there was a place for people like us, the ones who fell, but still wanted to rise again? That night, he opened his notebook again, not to mourn the past, but to design the future. He started sketching out the idea of a community platform for failed entrepreneurs, a digital space for those who wanted to rebuild. He called it Rise Up. Ethan had no money, no team, and no investors, but he had what money couldn't buy: purpose. He reached out to a few developers who had once worked with him at Skybridge. Most had moved on to stable jobs, but one of them, Anna Rivera, responded immediately. "I read your blog," she said on the call. "Count me in." Together, they started building the prototype. Ethan worked days as a freelance business consultant to pay bills and nights on the Rise Up platform. He coded, designed, and wrote until his hands hurt and his eyes burned. This time, he wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't trying to impress investors. He just wanted to create something useful, something honest. Months passed. Progress was slow. There were bugs, crashes, and endless setbacks, but Ethan no longer reacted with panic. He had learned something powerful from his downfall. Failure doesn't mean stop. It means start smarter. Whenever a problem appeared, he would smile and say, "Good, another lesson." Anna often joked that he'd gone from Ethan the overconfident CEO to Ethan the Zen monk of business. But deep down, Ethan knew why he had changed. He had lost the fear of losing. That, he realized, was the real freedom. 6 months later, Rise Up launched its beta version. It was simple. Entrepreneurs could sign up, share their stories, ask for advice, and connect with mentors who had survived failure. The first week, only 50 people joined. The second week, it doubled. By the third month, they had over 10,000 members. People weren't just joining. They were staying, because Rise Up wasn't about money or success stories. It was about truth. Ethan wrote weekly newsletters titled Lessons from the Ashes, where he shared insights about rebuilding one's life, business, and mindset. His favorite line became a mantra across the community: "You are not your failure. You are what you do next." Those 8 words appeared on t-shirts, posters, and even tattoos. As Rise Up grew, so did its visibility. One morning, Ethan received an email from a venture capital firm in San Francisco. They loved the concept and wanted to invest $2 million to scale it globally. It was the same kind of offer he had once jumped at without hesitation. But this time, he paused. He remembered how rapid expansion had destroyed Skybridge. So he told the investors, "I'm honored, but first, tell me, do you believe in profit or purpose?" The investor laughed. "Both, of course." Ethan smiled politely. "Then I'm afraid we're not ready for each other." He turned down the deal. When Anna found out, she was stunned. $2 million. Ethan, that could change everything. Ethan nodded calmly. Exactly. And that's why we have to be careful. We're not building another startup. We're building a legacy. It was a defining moment. The moment Ethan proved he had truly changed. A year after Rise Up's launch, Ethan was invited to speak at a major entrepreneurship summit in Los Angeles, the same city where he had once stood on stage years ago, young, rich, and arrogant. Now welcomed him again, older, humbler, and stronger. As he stepped onto the stage, he looked at the crowd of young dreamers and said, "When I was your age, I thought success meant being on this stage. But real success is standing here after life has pushed you off it and choosing to climb back up again." The hall erupted in applause. After his speech, journalists flooded him with questions, but one asked something that made him pause. "Ethan, do you think your failure was necessary for your success?" He smiled gently. "Yes, because failure is not the opposite of success. It's the teacher of it." That quote would later trend on social media, and Ethan's story began circulating in magazines, podcasts, and interviews worldwide. Despite fame returning, Ethan kept his lifestyle simple. He still lived in the same modest apartment, still made his own coffee, and still spent hours replying to messages from struggling entrepreneurs. He believed in staying close to the ground, because that's where growth begins. Rise Up grew into a network of 500,000 users across 40 countries. It hosted free mentorship programs, startup recovery workshops, and even mental health support for founders battling depression after business loss. For many, Ethan had become a hero, but to him, he was just a man who refused to stay broken. One summer, Ethan finally decided to visit his parents in Ohio after nearly 6 years. As he drove through the quiet countryside, he felt a mix of nostalgia and peace. His father, a retired mechanic, hugged him tight. "You've done well, son, but we would have loved you even if you hadn't." Those words hit Ethan harder than any success ever could, because for years he had chased validation from investors, magazines, and the world. But the truth was simple. He was enough, even without the titles. That night, he sat on the porch, watching fireflies in the dark. He realized something profound. Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right after you thought you couldn't be. A few months later, Rise Up received an unexpected message, a partnership proposal from a global education platform that wanted to integrate Ethan's mentorship programs into schools and universities. They wanted to teach young students how to handle failure early, to see it as part of growth, not as shame. Ethan was moved to tears. He had dreamed of a world where people could talk about failure without fear. Now it was happening. He signed the deal, but not for profit. All proceeds went to a scholarship fund called the Second Chance Initiative, helping young entrepreneurs restart after business collapses. When the media asked why he gave it all away, Ethan said, "Because I already have what I was chasing all my life, peace." By the end of that year, Rise Up was recognized as one of the most influential entrepreneur support platforms in the world. Ethan's name was back in Forbes, but this time under a different headline, "The Man Who Redefined Failure." He smiled when he saw it, but instead of framing the magazine cover like before, he quietly placed it in a drawer. He had learned that real success didn't need to be displayed. It needed to be lived. Ethan began his last blog entry with these words: "I once built a company that made millions. Then I built one that made a difference. The second one made me whole." He ended it with a message that echoed across the world. If you failed, you are not broken. You are just in the middle of your story. Keep turning the pages. The morning sun was warm against the glass walls of the Rise Up headquarters in Austin, Texas. The office was filled with quiet energy, people typing, collaborating, laughing, the sound of growth. Ethan Cole stood near the window, a cup of coffee in hand, watching his team. For years ago, Rise Up had been nothing but an idea scribbled in a notebook. Now, it was a thriving global platform with millions of members, mentorship hubs in 20 countries, and thousands of lives transformed. But for Ethan, success no longer looked like this. It wasn't the numbers, the office, or the magazine articles. It was the fact that every single person in this building believed in something he had once forgotten. That failure is not the end. Every Friday, Ethan held what his team called Open Table Day. Entrepreneurs, young, old, rich, broke, could walk into the Rise Up office, sit with him, and share their stories. No appointments, no filters, just real talk. That morning, a nervous young man walked in. He was in his 20s, wearing a wrinkled shirt, holding a small notebook. "Mr. Cole," he began, "I started a clothing brand 2 years ago. It failed. My friends say I'm wasting my time trying again." Ethan smiled warmly. "What do you say?" The young man hesitated. "I still believe in it, but I don't know if I can go through the pain again." Ethan leaned forward, eyes steady. "Then let me tell you something. The pain you're afraid of, that's not your enemy. It's your coach." He handed the man a card that read, "Rise again, one honest step at a time." The young man left with tears in his eyes. Moments like that reminded Ethan why he did what he did. He wasn't just building businesses anymore. He was building people, one soul at a time. But life, in its mysterious rhythm, wasn't done testing him. That same week, Ethan received an unexpected letter from a law firm in New York. It was from one of his old investors from Skybridge Technologies, the failed company that had once destroyed him. The investor, Richard Halden, was now suing him for intellectual property misuse, claiming that Rise Up system used an algorithm similar to one from Skybridge's early software. The accusation was false, but legally complex. If the case went public, it could damage Rise Up's reputation. Anna rushed into his office the moment she heard. "Ethan, we need to fight this immediately. Our lawyers are ready." Ethan nodded calmly. "We'll respond, but not with anger." She frowned. "You're seriously thinking about negotiating? After what these people did to you?" He smiled gently. "That's exactly why. Because I know what hate does to a man. It eats him alive." A week later, Ethan flew to New York for a meeting with Richard. It was surreal walking into the same kind of office where, years ago, he had begged investors for second chances. Richard was older now, gray-haired and stern. "I see you've rebuilt quite an empire," he said coldly. Ethan replied softly, "Not an empire, Richard, a community." They discussed the claim for hours. Ethan calmly explained how Rise Up's code was built from scratch and offered to open his data publicly for verification. Richard was taken aback by the transparency. "You'd risk that much?" Ethan smiled. "The truth doesn't need protection. Only lies do." The next day, Richard withdrew the case. Before Ethan left, Richard said something that stayed with him forever. "You know, years ago I thought you were just another arrogant kid chasing money. But you become something rare, a man who learned how to lose." Ethan shook his hand and replied, "Maybe losing was the best thing that ever happened to me." That evening, Ethan visited the old building that once housed Skybridge Technologies. It was now an office for a small marketing agency. The signboard was gone, but he still remembered the door, the glass panels, the long hallway. He stood there quietly, letting memories rush back. The excitement, the chaos, the tears, the final lock on the door. But this time he smiled, because now he understood. That place wasn't where he failed. It was where he began learning how to succeed. He whispered softly, "Thank you for breaking me, because you also built me." In the following months, Ethan shifted his focus. He stepped down as CEO of Rise Up and appointed Anna, as the new head. I built the foundation, he told her, but now it needs a new vision. He dedicated himself fully to mentorship, traveling to schools, community centers, and prisons to speak about resilience. In one of his sessions, a young man in a correctional facility asked him, "Do you really believe everyone deserves a second chance?" Ethan looked him straight in the eye. "I don't just believe it. I am it." Those words rippled through the crowd like fire. That night, he received over 200 letters from inmates who wanted to start learning about entrepreneurship after release. Rise Up launched a new branch soon after, Rise Up Rebuild, a mentorship initiative for ex-prisoners and recovering addicts who wanted to rebuild their lives. For Ethan, that was the proudest achievement of all. 2 years later, Ethan was nominated for the National Humanitarian Entrepreneurship Award. At the ceremony in Washington, he stood among politicians, CEOs, and philanthropists. When his name was announced, the crowd cheered, but Ethan didn't rush to the stage. He walked slowly, thoughtfully, as if every step carried a lifetime of lessons. When he reached the microphone, he said, "When I lost my company, I thought I'd lost everything. But I hadn't. I just lost a version of myself that believed success meant being better than others. Today, I stand here because I learned success means helping others become better than you." The entire hall gave him a standing ovation. That night, Ethan returned to his apartment, the same one where he had once written his first notes of despair. He sat by the same window, sipping tea instead of coffee this time. Outside, the city lights shimmered, and for once, he didn't feel small among them. He opened his old notebook, the one where he had written all his lessons years ago. On the first page, he had once scribbled, "I don't know who I am without success." He took his pen, crossed out those words, and wrote beneath them, "I am success because I didn't stop." He closed the notebook with a smile. A decade passed. Ethan was now 51. His hair had silver streaks, his eyes had softened, and his presence carried calm strength. Rise Up had become a worldwide movement, reaching millions through schools, workshops, and digital programs. He no longer gave speeches. Instead, he listened. He let others share their journeys, because now it was their turn to inspire. One afternoon, Anna brought him a letter. It was from a man named Liam, the same young entrepreneur who had once come to Ethan's open table day years ago. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Cole, my clothing brand is finally growing. But more importantly, I'm teaching others who fail like I did. You told me pain was my coach. You were right. Thank you for changing my life." Ethan smiled, folding the letter gently. He whispered, "That's it. That's the real profit." On a quiet Sunday morning, Ethan walked through a park, the same park where he used to run years ago to clear his mind. He sat on a bench, watching kids play, people jog, and an old man feed pigeons. And in that peaceful moment, everything made sense. Life wasn't about winning every battle. It was about learning from every loss. He had lost money, pride, and even hope once, but in doing so, he had gained empathy, strength, and peace. He realized that failure doesn't destroy dreams. It reshapes them. He took a deep breath and smiled at the sky. "I didn't build an empire," he thought. "I built something greater, belief." A few months before retiring fully, Ethan published one final blog post on the broken startup. It read, "To every dreamer who failed, I know how heavy that silence feels at night. I know the shame, the fear, the doubt. But please understand, the world doesn't need your perfection. It needs your persistence. Failure is not the period at the end of your story. It's the comma that gives your next chapter meaning. Don't give up. Rewrite, rebuild, rise again. Because sometimes, to find the light, we must first learn to stand in the dark." He ended it with one last line, a line that defined his entire journey. "Success is not about never falling. It's about learning to rise every single time."